Okay, first I'd like to thank the Folding Chairs Association and the Faith Assembly for inviting me. And my name is John Bergner, and I'm chair of the Divide New York Caucus Incorporated. And we've been working to redesign the state into autonomous regions. So basically, now those of you that have the handouts, I'm going to do slide A. And basically we started this around 2015. And the reason we started it in 2015 was basically a lot of jobs had left the state and a lot of people's kids had left the state due to the lack of jobs and the like. And upstate was in a major decline. And the reason it's in a decline is very simple. It's basically unfunded mandates. For those of you who don't know what an unfunded mandate is, it's basically when the state legislature wants a program but doesn't want to pay for it, it forces the local government to do the program and raise its own taxes to do that. So currently with unfunded mandates, I'll use an example, my own county, Albany County. The entire property tax of Albany County and 2% of their 4% sales tax all goes to unfunded mandates. The county has to run on the 2% remaining of the sales tax. Most other counties are this way. There's some variation, of course, between them based on their property tax worth and the other things, but that's basically what it happens. So that's why property taxes and sales taxes are so high. One of the most interesting things I always get a kick up is on school districts. Most of you are aware that school districts have to conduct their own elections. They conducted them in May, even though there's a primary in June. What's interesting is that school districts can't use the voter registration rolls. Well, actually, they changed that. Now they can, but they couldn't until 3 years ago use the voter registration rolls from the county. They had to have their own list, and that's why they were allowed to use photo IDs at school elections if they chose, where it's actually a misdemeanor to use a photo ID at the general election. So we can debate that back and forth why that is, but that's not really what we're here for, so I'll just skip over that. I just point that as a thing. The other thing about school districts is because they have to conduct their own election, the average size school district, it costs them $500,000 a year to conduct an election. When we have the complete staff, and they can't use the county staff to do it. That's basically a big chunk of school district budgets is just conducting elections. They have an awful lot of unfunded mandates. We have never been able to get a complete list of them all. We know there's over 5,000 of them. Now, most of them only add like 10 cents a thousand to your property tax, which isn't a big deal. But when you add them up by the number, there are some that the school districts and local governments may be in violation of because nobody remembers they're still on the books. So it's a very interesting thing. What's also killing the upstate economy is unnecessary regulations. What works well in a city like New York City does not work in a sparsely populated area. And the regulations are basically being drawn for densely populated areas, so they don't work in rural areas. One of the most interesting things is the Farm Bill that was passed by the state legislature about 5 years ago now, passed with no votes from any legislator who represented a farmer. So I always find that kind of interesting. The New Amsterdam regional government, which is what we would call upstate, would have the power to replace these regulations. And the amendment that would create it has a restriction on unfunded mandates. They'd all expire unless repassed by a 3/5 vote of the legislature. And if anybody knows anything about legislators, getting 3/5 of them to agree on the time of day is tough. So that would mean most would expire. Some of them do make sense, though, because they do have an unfunded mandate that if you have a water system, you have to test the water system every 6 months to make sure it's not become contaminated, which I actually think is a good deal. But a lot of them are just wasteful and make no sense at all. Now, if you go over to slide B, our succession plan calls for forming a more Republican form of government with a small r, which means more representative and minorities have more rights, so rural people have more rights and the like. We'd remove the regulations that are destroying us, and we would redesign the state into 3 autonomous regions. The upstate region would be known as New Amsterdam. The suburbs would be known as Montauk, which is Westchester, Rockland, and Long Island. And New York City would be New York City, the New York region. The token state government that's left to comply with the U.S. Constitution would be kept small by limiting its taxing power to a 3% sales tax. All other taxing powers go to the regions or the local governments. And that would mean basically the governor of New York, because we have to have one under the U.S. Constitution, but we're not required to give them any power, would have a little bit more power than the King of England currently does. To give you a best example I can get. To divide us into 3 regions, it takes an amendment to the New York State Constitution, which I'll go into later. What we would do is we would have 3 regions, each with its own elected legislature. And for 6 weeks a year, the 3 regions would meet together to act as the state legislature, with their votes weighted by the population of their districts to comply with the Supreme Court ruling Reynolds versus Sims, which is the one van, one vote ruling, which actually created the problem we're currently in. If you go to slide C. Now, the token state government, the laws it would be allowed to do are limited only to Indian affairs, which I find ironic. New York state law still calls it Indian affairs, so I'm using the actual quote from the law, even though that's now considered politically incorrect. But, and for the legislative branch only, the National Guard would remain under the state, but the state guard would go under the regional governors, because we have 2 guards in this state. I don't know if most of you are aware of that or not. There's a National Guard and there's a State Guard. A lot of times the same people are in both. In fact, almost always the same people are in both. And they sometimes have different ranks and depending on which one is activated. All the remaining laws, which is about 3/4 of the laws in New York State, would become regional laws. And the region could delete them or amend them or the like. Some of the ones that would become regional laws would be the SAFE Act, Common Core laws, that allows each region to modify them independently. So I assume the New York region would go super SAFE Act and we repeal part of it. So it might actually keep everybody happy. I don't know. Regional senators from all regions also serve as New York State senators, and regional assemblymen also say that. And I previously talked about the weighted votes. And then basically we outline the fiscal years for each of the state and the region so they don't overlap, so the same legislators can act as both regional legislators and part of the state legislature. That would bring us up to slide D. Each region gets an elected regional governor, an elected regional secretary of state, and of course its own regional lieutenant governor. The education departments would report to the regional governors. There'd be 3 of them. Currently, for those of you who are not aware, the education department currently reports to the assembly speaker.
To who?
The assembly speaker. Most people are not aware of that fact, but what it is the state legislature elects the Board of Regents, and the Board of Regents appoints the education commissioner. So that results in the Speaker of the Assembly actually controlling whether the education commissioner gets to keep his job or not. Indirectly, but basically. The token state government gets to keep an elected governor, an elected lieutenant governor, and the state controller. In order to prevent opposition to the plans, we will leave the pension system at the state level unchanged, and the amendment defines in detail how departments and employees are transferred to regional governments from the state. The amendment is self-implementing, and the reason for that is what happened to Staten Island in 1994, I believe it was. How many people are familiar with that? Nobody? Okay. Back in 1994, Staten Island voted with 60% of the vote to leave New York City. For the next 25 years, the bill to ratify it was stuck in committee. Now they don't even bother to introduce the bill anymore. So this amendment, once passed by the voters, is over 30 pages, and it implements itself. It requires no implementing legislation. Once it's passed, it takes effect. The amendment is detailed. So what happens is it defines exactly how the government is divided, who gets what, how equipment is divided, and who decides who gets what equipment. Everything is all there that would normally be put in an implementing law. So therefore, it can just, once it's ratified by the voters, it can take effect. Now, it also sets up so that kids will, or I should say college students, will still be able to attend whichever college they want, and their home region will pay for it. Prisons are set up so that the New Amsterdam region gets to keep 2 for men and 1 for women. And all the rest of the prisons will be assigned either to the Montauk region or the New York City region, because most of the inmates come from there anyway, and they will operate those. The powers of the Court of Appeals are transferred to the new regional superior courts, which will be the highest court in each region. And judicial apartments will be adjusted so they don't cross regional boundaries. Now, if you go over to slide E, this is my most fun slide here because it's so strange. This will allow us to redo the school aid formula. How it currently works with the New York State school aid formula is every budget year it's amended, but nothing in it that was there before is ever deleted. So then the education department goes through that and takes its best guess of how much aid each school district gets. Whether it's a big New York City school district, or it's an upstate school district, or a small rural school district, the formula is supposed to be able to handle that. The problem is since nothing's ever been deleted from it and it keeps being added to, nobody really understands the formula anymore, including the bureaucrats that implement it. So usually whatever they say goes, because no judge can interpret it either. It's a very interesting formula, and that's part of the reason our school taxes are so high in some places. The other part is they have an income tax offset on your school taxes. What that is, when you fill out a New York State tax return, you notice how you have to put in your school district name? They use your income to determine how much or how little aid each school district gets. But they never cross-check that with 9-digit zip codes or anything like that. So what happens is, say you're in the Poughkeepsie School District, but you're in the town of Poughkeepsie. Your income might count against the city of Poughkeepsie School District, because the town of Poughkeepsie has a different school district. And it works the other way too, depending on, because a lot of people without kids are not really aware which school district they're in, because their taxes are escrowed, so they don't really pay attention to it. If you have kids, you know what school district you're in, but if you don't, or you're a young couple that doesn't have them yet, a lot of times you don't know. This would allow regions to approve their own, and also the unfunded mandates on school districts, some of them which make sense and some of them don't. Like, one of the things is the elections will be taken over by the County Board of Elections. So that saves every school district $500,000, at least. Some of the bigger ones, it cost them more than that. So each region gets to design its own funding formula. Now, if you go over to slide F, okay, there are two ways to amend the New York State Constitution currently. One is a constitutional convention. It gets voted on every 20 years. It was voted down in 2017, so it doesn't come up again until 2037. Each senatorial district gets 3 delegates and 15 are elected at large. Option 2 is the state legislature passes an amendment twice with an election of legislators in between. It's just a simple majority, and a simple majority of the voters approve it. That's the method we're trying to. It's in committee. It didn't get out of committee this year, but we'll go over that in a second. We need to get more co-sponsors of the bill, but at this point, sponsorship is frozen because the legislative session is over for the 2 years. So next year, the bills will get new numbers. How we would be able to get this to work and get it out of there is, New York State's Constitution does not have a right of petition for the people, but it does have a right of petition for municipalities. New York does everything different, what can I say? Which is called home rule. So if a county were to pass a home rule resolution under the New York State Constitution, their senators and assemblymen that represent them are obligated to co-sponsor the bill they passed the home rule resolution about. They're not obligated to vote for it, but they are obligated to sponsor it or co-sponsor it. What basically happens with that is, we also have found out that no county, no town, no city has passed an official home rule resolution for at least 70 years. Because all those resolutions that were passed, like the SAFE Act resolutions and stuff, they were all non-binding resolutions, which means they're meaningless. A home rule resolution, after it's passed, a county official has to transmit it to their legislators. And after talking to 3 lawyers, since no court has ruled otherwise, the only way that's legal to transmit it is certified U.S. mail. So they have to send it by that because no court has ruled that email is equivalent. And as far as we've been able to determine, no town or city has done the second part on any resolution in at least 70 years. So if you look at slide G, we have sample home rule resolutions. We have about 3 towns that have passed them. We have no counties that have passed them. If we could get counties to pass home rule resolutions, that would get the issue in the press and get it, because what I discovered, because we have leaders, one of the reasons I like to stay neutral on a lot of issues is we have leaders in New York City too, and they are very liberal, to put it mildly, but they want to get rid of us for the exact opposite reasons that we want to get rid of them. So this issue, if it ever went to the voters, would be very popular in New York City, which is good because we would need it to pass. But that is how home rule resolutions there. If you look at the bottom, you notice the bill numbers that you've seen already are going to change again in January, because bill numbers change every odd numbered year as soon as we know what they are. But you can't get them in advance, so usually you have to wait till like February 1st to get the new bill numbers. And that's basically what slide G is about. And before I go over to the question part, I wanted you to have the separate handout here. We have a separate handout. We do this separately because when we incorporated it wasn't an option. So we're a state committee, so I'm doing this as an individual now. Since about 1867, every state that's come into the Union has come in a pair, one leaning Democratic and one leaning Republican. I went back, I haven't been able to find a single example of that. I did find one where they were separated by 3 years, but they had a gentleman's agreement to do it that way, back when gentlemen's agreements meant something. But in any event, what could be done is Puerto Rico could come into a state, they lean Democratic, and New Amsterdam could become a state leaning Republican. And that would balance it out. And basically, because that keeps the Senate even again, because that's what the big deal is. That's why Puerto Rico was blocked by the Senate when they passed a bill to admit it. They voted to come into the Union 4 years ago, even though they have more population than 4 states. They've been stalled by the U.S. Senate. So basically, what this would do is it's a resolution. You can see where if you see here, there's links on there to give you more of the details of it. If a congressman were to introduce it, I think most upstate congressmen and Long Island congressmen would have to co-sponsor it immediately because it would be so popular. This would take Nassau and Suffolk and the rest of upstate and bring us in the state. Westchester, Rockland, and New York City would remain New York City. The reason we think New York State would grant permission to do this is New York State currently is broke. They just got bailed out this year by federal presidential discretionary funds, basically. Their budget deficit was equal to almost half of the budget expenditure. But they got bailed out by presidential. If the presidency were to change next year and they weren't bailed out again, they'd be desperate for money, so they'd be willing to sell us in a heartbeat. So this would be a possibility then. We also have a third option coming up that we're looking into, but we haven't been able to find a law firm that has deep enough pockets to do it yet. Article 4, or is it Article 5? I'm doing this from memory, I'm sorry. Of the U.S. Constitution requires every state have a Republican form of government, small r. And New York now fails the test for having a Republican form of government. That being the case, we would like to have Reynolds versus Sims reversed and go back to having one senator per county, which is when upstate started to decline when Reynolds versus Sims first occurred when I was a little kid. 49 states have senates, and they were all designed to mirror the U.S. Senate based on geography, not population. And that was to balance the interest of urban voters versus rural voters. Our Constitution used to be passed by, amendments to it were passed by the legislature. Used to be, prior to Reynolds versus Sim, the Senate was by geography. So basically, rural people had a minority share in it. And even though we're densely populated in this part of New York, we're still rural compared to downstate. What happened when they repealed that, everything became a simple majority vote, which is pure democracy. To amend the Constitution of the state is a simple majority vote. To have the voters ratify it is a simple majority vote. There is no supermajority votes required except to override a governor's veto. The other things we discovered is basically when they did get enough power to override a governor's veto, they changed the election law so most of the minor parties in the state were eliminated because the number of votes you need to become a permanent party is prohibitively high now. And it's also very difficult without a lot of money. Unless you're a millionaire, you cannot get on a statewide ballot anymore because the number of signatures is prohibitively high.
2 questions about the home rule resolutions. If a county legislature passes a home rule resolution, is the state required to comply with that and not penalize the county because they disagree with the resolution?
Well, the Constitution says the legislators that represent are obligated to co-sponsor it. Now, what happens when they break that obligation? I guess it becomes a campaign issue. I don't really know if there's any penalty clause for that. As to retaliating to counties based on aid, that is also one of the reasons we are no longer a republic. We are now a pure democracy because the majority can punish anyone they want, any way they want, by cutting their funding.
Right.
Yes?
If you were going to give a sales pitch to a local politician, what would be your 3 biggest points? And that's always going to be money at some point. But
Okay, we figured out before we started this, on our website we have a page that I usually don't bring up because it usually puts the audience to sleep, but we could easily support ourselves. Upstate could, the Montauk region could easily support itself, and of course New York City could easily support itself. So we don't need funding from New York City. What is currently happening is, because of the unfunded mandates, we have to tax ourselves much higher than we would be required to if they were gone. If we were to operate like either Vermont or Pennsylvania, our property taxes could be 1/2 what they currently are.
that's based on money going to New York City?
That's because...
From the mandates from New York City that we have to comply.
Correct. If you look on our website, we have a study that was done by the Upstate Association of Towns. They haven't done another one since the pandemic, so we still have the old study. But it shows the taxes. It picked 2 towns, one in upstate New York and one across the border in Pennsylvania. And it showed the difference in taxes. And it was startling. And the really weird part is if we could get them to redo it, is the New York taxes have continued to rise and the Pennsylvania ones have not. But that's also on the website under Better Jobs, Lower Taxes.
What tips would you give us to get there or not get there?
Well, first we need counties to pass home rule resolutions. That's the number one thing to show we're still alive and it's not going to stay in committee forever. The bill is only 4 years old, so we're relatively new. It took us from 2015 to 4 years ago to get the bill introduced.
So how do we go about doing that?
Basically, that is the complicated part. One is the tax law savings for doing it that way. The other is we'd be our own bosses. We wouldn't be bossing New York City around when we have control, and they wouldn't be bossing us around when they have control. Everybody could run their own thing. And if somebody mismanages it, plus, when we wanted to divide into two states, both the Rockefeller, back in 2013 and 2010, RIT and the Rockefeller College did studies on splitting us into two states, and they both came to the conclusion we couldn't afford it. So we went, and that's what we did, we went through those two studies, and we discovered, one is, they left out 3 counties, because they were putting Dutchess, Putnam, and Orange in New York City, New York State. And that would, you guys have a lot more income than upstate does. So that would not work. And the other thing they assumed, but they did not, is that we would operate the same way we do now. If we operated the same way New York State now as a region, of course we'd have the same problems. That is, we'd have the same unfunded mandates, we'd have the same, like, by removing the mandates and letting governments, local governments decide what services their people want, that makes a whole lot more sense.
And how would we lock off these mandates?
The amendment has a clause in it that all mandates, whether by law or regulation, expire 1 year after the amendment takes effect, after the new regional governors are elected, and to restore them it takes a 3/5 votes of both houses of the legislature. So you're not going to get too many through that gauntlet. So most of them would just expire. What people wanted, what local governments would do. The question is, we also have, right now we have a tax cap for municipalities, but the voters don't get to vote on it. The amendment would force the voters to vote on tax cap if they want to override it. Because otherwise the surplus money would just be spent in some places and they would just keep it going. This will stop them from doing it because they have to explain to the voters why they need this or that. There are a lot of new services that are nice. Everybody likes nice things, but when you have to pay for them, it's another matter.
So again, how do we get our county to pass this home rule resolution?
You have to get, well, in Dutchess, are you in Dutchess?
Dutchess, yeah.
Okay, Dutchess County has a county legislature, so you have to get the county legislators, a majority of them, to pass the resolution. Since it's only a home rule resolution, the county executive is not technically involved. They just pass a resolution and then the clerk of the legislature sends it to their state senators and assemblymen.
I see.
Not to say that the county executive wouldn't have some influence over the legislature. It's sort of like the amendment for forming regions. When it's passed, the governor technically has no say over whether an amendment is passed or not. Can it be vetoed? Can it be signed? It just gets passed twice and then goes to the voters, skips the governor entirely. That doesn't mean Kathy Hochul wouldn't have some influence over the legislatures, though.
final question? Going once? Going twice?
Thank you.